Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm your host, Jared Zimmer, the Director of Outreach and Mission here at Word on Fire, and I'm delighted to say this is my first time hosting the show. And as always, a warm welcome to my good friend and intellectual mentor, Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop, it's so good to chat with you today.
Hey, Jared, good to hear your voice. How are the kids doing?
Oh, they're doing wonderful. Counting down the days to their new little sister. So
terrific. I'm delighted.
Now, I know one of your passions is academia and higher learning, and this past week you were able to take part in a symposium at your old stomping grounds, Mundelein Seminary. It's based on the book 2 Samuel. Can you fill us in?
Yeah, I was back, as you say, at my old place, Mundelein, where I was a teacher for many years, and I was rector for 3 years. And during my last years there, I was writing this book as part of the Brazos commentary series. So they get theologians to write biblical commentaries. And I wrote one on 2 Samuel, which is a wonderful text dealing with King David. So anyway, Matthew Levering, who was one of the brightest young scholars working in the church today, and I'm very proud to say I brought him on the faculty when I was a rector there. Matt organizes these things called the Logos Colloquium. And they get a scholar and then a group of 40 or so other scholars, and they discuss a particular book. So in this case, they were discussing my own 2 Samuel. So it was a joy. I came in there for about 2.5 hours. We just went around and, I did a little intro to the book, and then people just asked questions and dissected and objections and all sorts of things. So for an academic type like myself, it was a lot of fun.
Wonderful, wonderful. I think my favorite part of your book is your description of King David's demise as a product of the unraveling of God's intention for mankind and how Christ comes back in as the great gatherer to bring people back in a nonviolent way as the true family of Israel, which kind of lends right into today's topic, which is Jesus, which is a great topic. So for today's episode, we're going to begin a discussion about several topics that are near and dear to all of us here at Word on Fire. So to kind of give this a little bit of context, these are 8 principles on which we guide our mission as an apostolate. In other words, 8 aspects of our evangelical ethos. So to give that a little background, these 8 principles came about following a challenge from your mentor, Bishop Barron, Cardinal George, who, before he passed, asked the question, where are the movements we need for today? And in true Word on Fire fashion, we followed the challenge. So a few years ago, we began developing these principles and really trusting in the Holy Spirit to guide us in how we might be able to fulfill that missionary call from Cardinal George. And honestly, that's most of the reason why I've been hired here at Word on Fire, to propagate these principles in order to garner a missionary expression of Word on Fire's ethos. These principles stem from Bishop Barron's work and passion over the years, and one might say really express the beating heart of Word on Fire. So today, Bishop Barron and I are going to discuss the first of the 8 principles, one that I think is somewhat of a hinge principle or a cardinal principle on which the other 7 stand. That is Christocentricity. So Bishop, I think it would be best if we go ahead and start with a definition of terms. What exactly is Christocentrism?
Well, just the view that Jesus stands at the center of everything. If he's not just one teacher among many, which a lot of people today want to turn him into, but if he's the Logos made flesh, right? He's the divine mind, the divine pattern, the divine intelligibility made flesh, then he's that principle around which everything revolves. That includes the culture itself, that includes politics, that includes our personal lives, that includes our public lives. Everything finds its proper center in Christ. So we don't allow Christ to be positioned by something outside of himself. Rather, he positions everything else. So I've, probably overworked that image of the rose window from the Gothic churches, but Christ is the center of the rose, and then around that center, all the other elements cohere. And so it goes in a properly ordered soul. Think of your own life, So it goes in a properly ordered parish or city or society or culture or cosmos. Christ is the center, and then everything finds its place around it. So that's why you're right in saying it's a hinge principle for the whole Word on Fire movement.
Oftentimes Catholics are somewhat accused by Protestant brethren for not really placing enough emphasis on Christ. They say oftentimes that we're perhaps too distracted by Mary or the saints or the sacraments. Is this really the case, and are those things in competition with Christ?
No, and that's the key, as you suggest. There's no great Catholic thinker from beginning, of the church till the present day who has not placed Christ at the absolute center of things. But we tend not to see a competition between Christ and other elements. In fact, go back to the rose window image. He's the center, but then all these other realities can cluster very beautifully around that center. And so does Mary have a role to play? Sure. Saints, of course. The arts, yes. Philosophy, yes. So it's not a competition. Like if I make Christ central, then everything else has to really give way. It has to give way from the central spot. That's true. But around that center, radiating really infinitely outward, all these other elements can find their place. And that's the way I think the great Catholic thinkers and writers and theologians have always seen it.
Well, speaking of great theologians, it's funny because on the other end of the spectrum, we have Thomas Aquinas, who was actually criticized for being too obsessed with Jesus by a few of the critics of his day. In fact, he once wrote in a commentary that to know Christ is to fill the mind. And I honestly don't think he was just speaking niceties or pious language. But can a person ever be too obsessed with Jesus? And if not, why not?
Well, I'd say, yes and no. Yes, you can be too obsessed if you construe it along competitive lines. If you say, well, look, I fill my mind with Christ, and therefore there's no room for science. Therefore, there's no room for the arts. There's no room for, having an engaged public life, etc. That's the wrong way to see it. Then you're putting him in a competitive relationship. But if you say, as Aquinas quite rightly puts it, Christ fills the whole mind, well, he's the Logos. Therefore, see, here's the key. All the other logoi, I'm using the plural there of the Greek term, all the other logoi find their place around him or in him or through him. So mathematics, sure. Science, of course. Politics, yes. Family life, yes. All those other logoi find their place in and around the central logos. See, and it's good because we're kind of amplifying what we mean here when we say Christocentrism. Not Christo-exclusivism, but Christocentrism. That's the right way to see it.
Yeah, and in some of the modern theological subculture, we find Christ as something more symbolic, something rather domesticated, a lot less dangerous, if you will, which ultimately reduces his divinity and the shock of who Christ really is. So in light of Christocentricity, making Christ the center of our life, why is it so important not to whitewash the real Jesus?
Yeah, and you're right, Jared. It's always a danger, especially I think in the modern times. If he becomes just one among many, then I've domesticated him, and then I start controlling him. I start saying, well, yeah, I like this and what he says, but that I'm not so crazy about. This part of my life, Jesus can be the Lord of it, but not every part of my life. So a domesticated Jesus is a defanged Jesus, and therefore one that is not properly Lord of my life. And that's a very powerful image, isn't it? If he's the Lord, he's the Dominus of every aspect of my life, well, that's, as you put it quite rightly, kind of a dangerous idea. So we sinners rebel against that. We prefer to keep him sequestered, or he's a influence on one area of my life. But the Lord who wants to be the Dominus of everything in my life, that's a little frightening, a little dangerous. But that's the Christ that is truly our Savior.
Yeah, oftentimes whenever I hear someone say, well, Jesus was a nice guy or a good spiritual guru or something like that, I often point towards one of the more controversial moments in his words in Luke 14, where he says, if anyone comes to me without hating his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. That certainly sounds dangerous. It sounds somewhat harsh. So how ought we to appropriate that verse in light of the fact of the real Jesus?
It's precisely as we've been doing it so far. That's the right context for it. In other words, when he says, unless you hate your mother and father, he's not urging us to engage in a psychological hatred of our parents. What he's saying is, unless you replace your parents with me at the center of your life, you're not worthy to be my disciple. If your parents, even your family, the nearest and dearest to you, are the center of your life, there's a problem. Now, can they fit into the great rose window of your life? Of course they do. Of course. But Jesus has to be, without competition, the center of your life. So I would do it that way. Once you get that rubric in place, then a lot of Jesus statements, you go, oh yeah, now it opens up. Hey Lord, I'll follow you, but first let me bury my father. And you think, well, yeah, of course. I mean, that's the demand of the most basic familial obligation, right? But let the dead bury their dead, because your relation to your father, as powerful and important as that is, can't be the center of your life. So once Christ is clearly there, then yes, you'll properly understand your relationship to your father and your family, etc. Or now fill in the blank, to money or your career or your country or whatever it happens to be. Fine. They all find a place around the center, but they can't be in the center.
Yeah, and you offer 3 paths of holiness, or paths to holiness, throughout much of your work, and those being finding the center, knowing you are a sinner, and your life is not about you. And you continue to say that it's really step number 1 is finding Christ as the center of your life, and that becomes the foundation by which you fulfill these other paths. So what practical steps would you suggest people take today to begin centering their life around Jesus?
Yeah, good. Whereas everything we've been saying so far is path 1. So you're right; those 3 paths, everything we've been describing so far is the basic one, is the foundational one. How do you do it? That's why the church talks about prayer so much. What's prayer? But it's the great intentional act of finding the center, right? And whether it's, I just was in my chapel, for my holy hour this morning and doing the office of the church that I'm obliged to do as a priest. What was I doing but finding the center again for this day, asking the Lord to be the ground and center of everything that I do today. What's the rosary? But that is a finding of the center. What is the Jesus prayer? But a finding of the center. What's the Mass? The central prayer of the church, the source and summit of the Christian life, but finding the center. So I would urge that is people need to pray regularly. As Thomas Merton said, finding the time is principle 1 for prayer. But prayer is the path toward finding the center.
So, Bishop, in light of the fact that Christ really does have this unique dangerousness to him, what makes him so much different and set apart from many of the other founders of religion or spiritual gurus that people are following?
Yeah, it's a good question, Jared. And you don't want to, there's one extreme on this thing, which is, Jesus, 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 and then everybody else, all the other spiritual teachers and founders are just nothing. Well, that's not right. And the Catholic Church talks about, rays or points of light in all the great spiritual traditions. And indeed, you can find those. Look in Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam and Judaism and so on. You're going to find all kinds of wonderful, rich spiritual insights, ideas, and the church, builds on those and accepts those and sees them as reflections of Christ. So having said that, to your question, what's the difference? The difference is the claim that Jesus makes about himself, which is absolutely unique. And it's not to denigrate the founders of other religions in any way, but to their credit, they don't make the claim that Jesus makes. They don't say that I myself have to be the center of your life. They tend to say something like what I'm teaching, or the experience of God that I've had, or the law that I've been given I want to give to you. But then there's Jesus, see, who is qualitatively different. Because he will say, I am the center of your life, unless you love me more than your mother and father. You've heard it said in the Torah, but I say, these extraordinary claims that he makes. Who do people say that I am? That question that we Christians are so used to, but we don't realize how weird that question is, because no other founder asks a similar question, right? The Buddha is not going to worry particularly about, well, what's my ontological makeup? Who am I? He'll say, no, I've got this teaching for you. Muhammad and Muslims aren't going to be the least bit concerned about who Muhammad is. Well, he's a human being who's a bearer of this message from Allah, right? And then there's Jesus, who is massively interested in propagating who he is. And see, a lot hinges on that distinction. That's why he himself is central to Christians in a way that other founders aren't central to their followers. The teaching of the founder is. But for us, the founder himself, right? I am the vine and you're the branches. Live in me. Eat my body and drink my blood. See, I mean, all of that is distinctively Christian talk. And it does make a huge difference.
Now, it's time for our listener question, which goes right into these devotions of Christ. Now, remember, if you have any question for Bishop Barron, be sure to go to askbishopbarron.com and record your questions from any device, and perhaps you'll be featured on one of our upcoming episodes. So today's question comes from Todd from Hinsdale, Illinois, who asks about a particular devotion that Catholics have in regard to Christ.
Hi, this is Todd from Hinsdale, Illinois, and I was wondering if Bishop Barron could explain the significance of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. I understand that the Church recently celebrated this feast, and I was just wondering what makes it so special, the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Thanks.
Yeah, good. Thank you for that question. And coming from Hinsdale, that's my old stomping grounds. I grew up in Western Springs, which is right next to Hinsdale. In fact, I played football when I was a little kid in this beautiful football field. I can just see it now in Hinsdale. So thanks for reminding me of that. You know, the Sacred Heart of Jesus is really on this point that we're talking about. Think of the heart as the center, so that the physical organ of the heart is sort of the center of the whole, circulatory system of the body. We also use heart metaphorically as a way of naming the center. What's in your heart? So you got all these different feelings and all these different reactions and emotions. But what's in your heart, we say? That means what's like the central concern, of your life? So the Sacred Heart of Jesus is the center of his existence. And what did he himself say? But my life is doing the will of my Father. That's his center. Now, make his center your center. Make his heart your heart. That great image from the icons of St. John at the Last Supper leaning on the breast of Jesus. Well, what that is listening to his heart. The heart of Jesus is doing the will of his Father. When we listen to his heart, then our heart, our center, becomes doing the will of the Father. And that's why that feast is so important. And that image of the Sacred Heart, don't sentimentalize it, because that's the trouble. Especially the way it's often depicted in art, it seems kind of, sentimental, superficial. But that's not a superficial idea at all. It's very profound. What's your heart? See, that's a good spiritual question. What's the beating heart of your own life? Well, you got to make it the heart of Jesus, see, and then you're going to find your proper center.
So this begins basically our discussion into even more. We'll have 7 following episodes going deeper and deeper into all of the other aspects, the 8 principles of our mission, of our apostolate here at Word on Fire. So thank you so much for tuning in to the Word on Fire show. Be sure to check out our website, wordonfireshow.com, for several links regarding the topic we discussed today. Also, I would highly suggest picking up a copy of Bishop Barron's book, The Priority of Christ, to dive even deeper into our topic. And can I ask you a favor? If you're enjoying the show, please go to the Word on Fire Show podcast on iTunes and leave us a review. The more reviews we get, the more people we can reach and draw into this amazing spiritual life of Catholicism. So thanks in advance, and God bless, and we'll see you back here next week on the Word on Fire show.